How matake yape, shante washte, ampetukinle. Good evening, my relatives. Thank you for joining us here this evening. I'm State Senator Mary Kunesh. I am the co-chair and the author of Minnesota's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. And we thank you all for joining us this evening to learn about the task force, find out how it happened and some of the things that we will be doing in the future as legislators, as community members, as advocates, as commissioners, all of those things. And so we would like to say Wopala Tanka Chi Miigwech for joining us here this evening. You'll hear from a number of different folks here that have worked on the task force, who have personal stories, who have honored those that they have lost or their family members that have survived the violence that has happened way too often to our Indigenous community. And so once again, I say thank you for joining us. And I would like to start us off this evening with a prayer from great-grandmother Mary Lyons.
Bonjour, can you hear me? I don't know. Can you hear me? Good.
Yep, we can hear you.
Anin, Nishnibi Equa Indisnakas. I'm going to start the evening off with a prayer to help bless this circle and all the events that are happening throughout this time. Creator, Argichimani Du, please forgive us as we sit humbly weak, asking for guidance to move forward in a good way. To our ancestors, our grandfathers and grandmothers that paved the pathway since the beginning of time, please instruct us through dreams, memories, and mentors so that we walk in a good way. To the 7 directions, starting in the east, as this is the beginning of light. To the south, to the west, and to the north. To Father Sky, Mother Earth, and the Spirit Tree. We honor all that was given to each of us and to embrace the kindness that is to spread out to these arenas we call home.
Mary?
Excuse me, you've gotten...
You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
There you
Now
go.
we can hear you.
Okay, I'll start over real quick. Creator, Argichimani Du, please forgive us as we sit humbly weak, asking for guidance to move forward in a good way. To our ancestors, our grandfathers and grandmothers that paved the pathway since the beginning of time, please instruct us through dreams, memories, and mentors so that we walk in a good way. To the 7 directions, starting in the east, as this is the beginning of light, to the south, to the west, and to the north, to Father Sky, Mother Earth, and the Spirit Tree. We honor all that was given to each of us and to embrace the kindness that is to spread out to the arenas we call home. We as Anishinaabe people have wintered the harshness of the oppressors throughout time. It may have been that they have taken our women, killed our men. It may have been through tainting our foods while in captivity. It may have been through a hanging or a bullet. It may have been an illness in a blanket. Either way, we as Anishinaabe peoples of this land have prevailed. Our seeds were kept in treasure cupboards of our women's wombs. Our men raised from the ashes of the wars. Our children witnessed the struggles and persevered through the storms. We as Anishinaabe peoples have been wearing the masks of change throughout time. They may have cut our hair, silenced our tongues, blinded our beliefs, and crippled our families by the dismantlement of our organic lifestyles. But we are still here. Through our natural medicines and a DNA line, a rope from the past that saved each of us as they tried to erase us. You see, we've been through these epidemics and the removals and the sacrifices of all these oppressors, as they need to stand taller than each of us. We are the seeds of mankind, a creation that Creator spoke of, and we will make it through whatever's tossed in our pathways. We are initiate peoples of these lands, the original gardeners. You cannot erase us. We are here. We are the forever people of this land. Creator, please let the smoke wash over each of us. Collect our thoughts of gratitude and gather our worries. We lift our prayers up to the sky world. Please let our ancestors witness that we all try our best to live with good intentions they have taught us. May we move forward in this time in a good way and hopefully be productive in these cyber cycles. So I want to say chi miigwech mani do, and may we all have a good meeting tonight. Miigwech aho.
Chi miigwech, great-grandmother, those were words that will inspire us and bring us hope and strength as we move forward through our days. So next, I would like to invite Sarah Curtis. Sarah is the co-director of Men as Peacemakers, and she has a poem to share with us. Sarah?
Miigwech. Why every time the snow starts falling do I fall apart? Wishing, hoping, praying that you were welcomed by the ancestors before you ever felt the sharp bite of cold. Insult to injury, as you lay in the woods, that ditch, the floor, the swamp, the trunk, the we don't know where. The unknowing breaks me. You were so warm. The sheer wattage of your smile challenged the sun as your big Native woman laugh echoed over the water. The way you'd put that twinkle in your ma's eye and get her to say exactly what she thought, and we would all laugh. I'm so lonely here without you. I miss my friend. I miss my friends, and I'm sorry, girl, but I can't pull it together tonight. Because every time the first snow falls, I wonder if you were cold.
Oh, Kalamia for that, Sarah. Thank you very much. I think I am not the only one that was moved by that poem, and we can only imagine what precipitated it. Thank you very, very much for sharing that with us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So we'll begin our program here this evening, and I just wanted to, for those that have joined us and aren't quite familiar with this Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, I thought I would give you a little bit of background, how it came to be and how it was formed in the way that it did to make it so successful. About 4 years ago, I had heard the reports coming out of Canada about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, and we had that heartbreaking murder of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind in the Dakotas, and it spurred me to go back to the capital and gather groups from the community, women from the community that I knew worked in the worlds and the mission of protecting and providing safety and resources to women who were victims, or families who were victims of violence, homelessness, all sorts of different issues. And they came when I asked them to join me, and I asked permission from the community to create a task force that would study Minnesota's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. Unfortunately, we didn't have data to back up the fact that our Native women are victims at higher rates than any other population of people across the nation, and not just in Minnesota. We had some bit of information coming out of the West Coast, but we didn't have anything to show in Minnesota, and we knew that we would need data to move the people to take some action. And so with the blessing and with the collaboration of the community of Native women in our state, we crafted a piece of legislation that is now the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. They came to tell their stories to the legislature. They moved rooms of people to tears as they told the stories, how they themselves had been victims and are now survivors, how they had lost loved ones, how generation after generation, our women, our girls, our men, our boys, our two spirits went missing and oftentimes murdered. And it came as a surprise to most people to hear this. You know, the biggest question is like, how is this happening? Why is this happening? Where is this happening? How many is this happening to? And unfortunately, we had stories to tell, but we didn't have the hard facts to tell. And so with full support from both sides of the aisle at the state legislature, both in the House and the Senate, we were able to pass a task force that comprised of agencies and nonprofits that were already doing the work of helping survivors, of addressing sex trafficking in Minnesota, commissioners from across the state, the Indian tribes, survivors, their families, lawmakers. And within 18 months, we were able to put together a pretty remarkable report right this past December. We couldn't have done it without the task force members, and we certainly could not have done it without Nigel Perrote and Kate Weeks from our state government. And we'll be hearing from Nigel a little bit later. But I wanted to share that with you and let you know that that's not the end of our report, of our task force. We've come up with a series of recommendations and mandates that we will discuss a little bit later. And we've been able to get the governor to include a substantial amount of money for the next 2 years to create a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Office in our state government, staff it, fund it, and we will continue the work. So at this time, I would like to invite my vice chair, my co-chair, our co-chair for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force, Nicole Matthews, to give us a bit of an update, and then we will continue on with our program. Nicole?
Thank you, Senator. Good evening, everyone. MMIWSAC, MNCASA, Migazine Dodame. My name is Nicole Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Indian Women Sexual Assault Coalition. So happy to join you all tonight. As the Senator said, I'm the Vice Chair of the task force, and I certainly couldn't envision that we would have gotten as much work as we had gotten done in 18 months time, and during a pandemic, and at a time when we weren't able to meet, and we were fortunate to be able to have some in-person events where we got to listen to some of our relatives who had been most impacted. And I think, for me, that's always at the heart of our work, is making sure that we honor the voices of our survivors, the voices of our families, and that we're always listening to the people who've been most impacted, those who have stories to share, and those who can tell us what's needed. How do we really make change? What's really broken? What really needs to be, done differently or strengthened, or what we need to remove and replace? And, so I'm really blessed that I was able to join this task force, that I've been able to work with some incredible people in the task force, and to speak to community members across the state, and to work with all of our tribes. I think it was really important that we didn't just have one or two representatives from tribes, that we included a representative from every single tribe, and tribal organizations and tribal nonprofits and those who are serving our victims and our families, which I think is really important. So I'm excited to see, as we move into implementation planning, I'm excited to see what will come out of that. And I think we're really fortunate to have leadership in our state government, in the Senate and the House, that is, our people that represent our communities that are pushing legislation. And we have leadership, in the governor's office with our lieutenant governor. And I think that is really helping to shift a lot of things on this issue right now. So I'm grateful for all the work that we've done and all the work we are going to continue to do.
Thank you, Nicole. Nicole is very integral in organizing and keeping this task force as productive as it is, and we can't thank her enough, both for the work that she's done on the task force and in her own capacity in her job. Next, I'd like to introduce a couple of key people that were absolutely instrumental in the success and the production of this task force. And one of those persons is Nigel Perrote. Nigel and I happened to be seated at a table months before, at a dinner months before a Hello? Months before this event started, or the task force began. And when I introduced myself, he looked at me and said, when you do that task force, I'm going to be working on that. And that was when I knew that the community was paying attention, that people were paying attention and planning how this was going to be successful right from the start. And honestly, had it not been for Nigel Perrote, who at that time worked for our Minnesota Department of Public Safety, now is with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And for that, we would like to say Chi Miigwech, Wopala Tonka, Nigel, and in just a minute, we will be hearing from him as well. Also, I would like to acknowledge and thank Nicole Martin-Rogers. Nicole is a researcher with the Wilder Institute. When you see any of our presentations and slides, that is the work of Nicole Martin-Rogers. When you look and read the report, that is the work of Nicole Martin-Rogers and her team at the Wilder Research. And so again, I want to say Chi Miigwech, Wopala Tonka, to all of you for the work that you've done. And then I would also like to express my appreciation to Stephanie Autumn. Stephanie is an independent contractor that worked with us on this project, and she as well guided it, nurtured it, and we are eternally thankful to her as well for the work that she has done. And I'd like to thank all the other task force members, some that may be on here today, and I hope that we will have time for you to show your face, say your name, and let us recognize you and appreciate you for the good hard work that you have done over these last months, because we could not have been as successful as we were without all of you. And so at this time, I would like to now invite Nigel Perrote, Nicole Martin-Rogers, Stephanie Autumn, if you are there, to join us and tell us a little bit about the work that you did with this task force. Maybe give us an overview from your perspective, share some of the findings, and then maybe even some of the mandates that were in this report. So Nicole Matthews, please stay on and we'll discuss this task force.
Thank you for having me tonight. I'm glad to be here to talk with you, and I'm happy to talk about kind of what we did for the task force and some of the key findings. It's hard to know where to start in a conversation like this because there was so much work that we did, but while I research, the nonprofit where I work was contracted by the Department of Public Safety, and we did a number of different things, including reviewing published articles, and we interviewed 32 experts that know about different aspects of the MMIW injustice. And we heard from experts in the state of Minnesota, like coroners and people that run the Missing Persons Clearinghouse at the BCA. And those were things that the task force did as a full group before the pandemic started, and we had to go to virtual meetings.
Thank you, Nicole. Nigel, tell us what you know.
Yeah, so I think in the story you were telling before, Senator Kunesh, it just it was just a lot of just happy coincidences, I think, that really made things work, especially in light of the pandemic and even with some of the civil unrest after the murder of George Floyd as well, that really kind of disrupted this process. But for myself and being involved in this process during my time at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety was really a opportunity to kind of rely on some of the skills I've learned throughout my career and revolving around addressing sexual violence and violence against Native women as a whole. Being in the position I was with the Department of Public Safety was kind of my role there was a tribal liaison, and so within that role, sometimes there's other tasks as assigned, and so this was an other task as assigned when I started working on the coordination side for the Department of Public Safety and kind of making sure we were doing our due diligence and following the statutory language and putting this together. And really the way I looked at it is that we have a lot of different experts that we are made up the task force membership. And so I really looked at it as, this is a very, I have a skeleton of what I think should happen, but it really is the driving force behind it was our task force memberships and really pushing us towards us in terms of the Department of Public Safety, Nicole and her team over at Wilder and Stephanie as well, kind of pushing us where they needed us to go and getting them the information they needed. One of the big things that I took out of this entire process was just the dedication and the expertise that needs to be at the table was at the table in developing the mandates and recommendations to address the very specific system failures that continually disenfranchise Native women and girls and Native people in general when it comes to the criminal justice system, and recognizing that the failures of the state within the Department of Public Safety and other systemic responses throughout the process or throughout the criminal justice process were really, I think, always apparent to a lot of us that worked in the field and worked in advocacy, but to see it actually kind of put on paper now and really highlight what those systemic failures are, I feel confident and I feel gratitude for the people that were at the table to continue pushing this forward and moving towards a time and date. And I don't think it's next year, a couple of years from now when we come back to this type of space to share. I firmly believe that we'll share a lot of stories that are showing that justice is happening now for Native women and girls and people.
I can't agree with you more, Nigel. I feel like this is just the beginning of this task force, of this momentum addressing the injustice with our missing and murdered Indigenous women. For those that haven't followed this task force or are a little bit unfamiliar with the historic trauma and injustice with our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, Some of the facts, the really startling facts, are that although American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state's population, between the years of 2010 through 2018, 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And from anywhere between 27 to 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota went missing in any given month from 2012 to 2020. And people will ask us, how does this happen? If they've gone missing, have they all been found? What is the story behind it? But the truth of the matter is that this has been sort of a situation that has been hidden from society for generations and generations. And it really began back when the white man first stepped his foot on this continent, or any continent that was colonized, because women and children were often the most disposable population of any, sort of used and abused and thrown away. And so over the hundreds of years, there has a real distrust has been formed within our Native community towards authority, whether they're the police, oftentimes faith-based organizations, and governmental agents, because often for hundreds of years, our Native children were literally torn from the arms of their parents, forced into boarding schools where their hair was cut. They were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to wear the clothing that they brought with them, and were often beaten and died of illness, sadness, abuse, and those sort of things. And then there was also what we in Canada they called the 60s sweep, but where Indian children were again literally stolen, removed from their families, from their homes for the least amount of reason, and again put into foster care homes, not with Native folks, but with other white folks, and then adopted out. And through this system, it destroyed the family system within the Native communities, and it provided so much distrust that when a woman went missing or found murdered, it was often dismissed in heartless ways. If they were missing, maybe they had run away, they had left with their boyfriend, oh, they're out partying. We heard stories about families calling the police and were totally dismissed. And maybe it was looked into long after any evidence would have been there. And the stories show that this continues to this day. And for these reasons, we worked hard to create sort of mandates or expectations from this task force. And part of that was to examine the systemic causes behind violence that Indigenous women and girls experience, examine and find appropriate methods for tracking and collecting data, because we know one of the biggest problems was that we didn't have data, or any data that was collected was collected in such a haphazard way that we really couldn't make sense of it. We wanted to make sure that we had reports on measuring necessary measurement to address and reduce those violence, and examine measures to help those families and the survivors of this kind of violence. And then we wanted to make sure that there was a report, that we actually could collect data. We could create a report on policies and institutions such as policing, child welfare, coroner practices, and other governmental practices that impact violence against Indigenous women and girls, and then ensure that there was investigation and prosecution of the crimes of gender violence against our Indigenous people. And so those were our guiding points as we created this task force. And I have to say that it was an incredible group that we were able to put together. Nicole, maybe you would like to share a little bit about our task force as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think, there's so many issues when you were talking about, boarding schools and, foster care, children being removed and placed into foster care in the 60s. Minnesota still has some of the highest rates of out-of-home placement of our Native children. And so we know, when we were doing our Garden of Truth research, that's one of the findings we learned from that, was that a number of the women who had been used in trafficking had been in foster care, an average of 4 foster homes, and many of them had been abused in those foster homes and had run away and been exploited on the streets. And so we know the connections, right? Many of those women also told us stories of other Native women who had disappeared, and they had never seen nor heard of them again. So we have a lot of anecdotal information. There's so many issues with data, right? We've heard a number of stories about data. For instance, we hear that race data is really hard to capture accurately. So we've heard that, oftentimes Native women are being misrepresented as maybe African American or maybe white or maybe Latino. And so they're not being identified as being Native. And we hear, about, I think there's also something to be said about who is, and you alluded to this earlier, Senator, but about who is really worthy of going to look for, and who are we really, who are the, quote unquote, and I hate this term, but the throwaways that people aren't going to go looking for, that not as many people are going to make a big deal about. And I think there are perpetrators that believe that Native people, Native women, are those throwaways. Doing the Garden of Truth research, one of the sex buyers said to a woman, "I thought we killed all of you." That's the level of violence. That's the level of hatred and the level of invisibility of us, in the community, on the streets, and is related to this issue and why it's so challenging and so difficult to address.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. The stories that we heard during this, the gathering of information for the task force were, again, very heartbreaking, but they really motivated us to continue with this work. Some days you feel like I just can't listen to another one of these heartbreaking stories. And yet we do, because we know how important it is to our community. One of the issues that we have found within our state is a very complex jurisdictional nightmare around who is responsible for investigating and prosecuting acts of violence, whether on Indian land or outside of Indian land. And Nicole Martin Rogers, would you like to maybe speak to that just a little bit, please?
Sure. I would be glad to talk about this. And this map that we're showing here shows that there are 11 sovereign Indian tribes in Minnesota. The map just really shows the tip of the iceberg in terms of the jurisdictional complexity that law enforcement has to navigate when a crime occurs in Indian country. You can see there's Public Law 280 tribes. Those are tribes that are covered by this federal law that was created in the 1950s and passed over some of the authority for investigating certain types of crimes to the state government. There's a couple of tribes in Minnesota that are exempt from Public Law 280. And this really determines, depending on who the perpetrator is and who the victim was and where the crime occurred, which jurisdiction or jurisdictions may have responsibility for investigating a crime. And this is oftentimes pointed to as one of the causes of the MMIW injustice. And it certainly creates challenges and loopholes that exacerbate the MMIW injustice. There's other jurisdictional issues besides just Public Law 280 in Minnesota, and I'm sure in other states. But really, jurisdictional issues are not the only cause, or perhaps even the main cause of the MMIW injustice. Although we did really find from this study that there's lots of places around the state where improved tribal county-state relations would help to more effectively investigate and prosecute MMIW related crimes, and really probably even to prevent MMIW related crimes from happening in the first place if there was better partnerships across these different agencies and jurisdictions.
Yes, thank you for explaining that. It's extremely complicated. There are places where if a man is the perpetrator on an Indian reservation or Indian land, there is nothing that the county police or the federal government or the state police can do because of this very complicated jurisdictional issue. And one of the things that we would like to see eventually is a strong collaboration between all levels of police officers and investigating organizations, so that those sort of things, because the perpetrators know that this is their gig. They know that they can't be prosecuted. Nothing can happen while they're in this neutral land. And so these are one of the things that we have to address and speak to. Nigel, you've been working in these realms or these resource areas around violence against our community members. Could you share a little bit of the work that you've done there and how it has affected our Native communities in the past, and what services might be available at this point?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we recognized within the context of the report was that there seems to be a lack of culturally specific services, particularly, not just around the, meeting the needs in terms of the crime victim advocacy for victims and helping them through the criminal justice system. But the part of that too is also a lack of meeting the basic needs of victims that are, that address economic instability and poverty, that just exacerbate the vulnerabilities and further increase the systemic gaps as well. And so housing, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, things like that would also be beneficial and help along the way in terms of not just seeking justice, but also addressing healing and some of those pieces around trauma that we spoke to in the report. I think when I was particularly in the field that I worked in prior to coming to the Department of Public Safety, now coming back to the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, I think there's been some leaps and bounds, particularly when we look at some of the work that has been done recently through Safe Harbor and creating a better system of response to youth that have been involved or at risk for trafficking, increasing housing-specific services, advocacy-based services, mental health services, and kind of the gamut of things that were necessary to address kind of all the needs. And then during my time at the Department of Public Safety, there were specifically within the Office of Justice programs that serves the crime victims of Minnesota, there was always a really concerted effort to ensure that some of the gaps that exist within the crime victim services of Native people were really being met. And so we really pushed, and I think I was really fortunate to work with a leadership team over there that really valued and saw the need for increasing services through not just the day-to-day crime victim advocacy services, but also looking at those criminal justice responses as well. And so it's one thing that I saw most recently that was, I think, in response to this that came out with some recent funding through the Office of Justice programs that addresses those some special project dollars that address some of those kind of collaboration efforts and increasing the outcomes for victims as they move through the criminal justice system.
It's good to know that there are advocates and folks out there that are willing to work on these issues. When we created this task force, as I said, we reached out to our Native communities and asked them who would they want to see on this task force. We wanted it to be created with them, for them, and by them. And by them, I mean the community members, survivors of this violence, family members who have worked so hard with that, and then different agencies within our state government. And when I started working on this task force, I was a new legislator in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and knew that I wanted folks from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, from the Sheriff's Office, from the U.S. Attorney, judges, county attorneys, the epidemiologists, all of these folks needed to be part of this task force. And so I went to them personally and said, I'm creating, working on this legislation. Would you be willing to participate in it? Because I didn't want anybody that would be reluctant or wasn't going to come in with a good heart. And fortunately, every single one of those organizations or those departments said, yes, absolutely. We are familiar with what's going on. We need to address this issue. And so we have those members on our task force. We had a representative from all 11 tribes on our task force. We wanted to make sure that there were agencies that were already doing the work, that knew intimately the trauma and the pain that our community members were going through and understood it right from the start. So we included Mending the Sacred Mending the Sacred Hoop, the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, Nicole Matthews' organization, Minnesota Indian Women's Assault Coalition, the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. And also we included an organization from Northern Minnesota called Lifehouse. And that member is Sheila Lamb. And Sheila, are you there with us that you could maybe share with us a little bit about the work that you have done and the work that you have continued to do on behalf of our Native communities?
Absolutely, Miigwech Senator. I work with trafficked and at-risk youth, so we made sure that they also had a voice at the table. And one of the big reasons for this is the fact that so many of our relatives are also sex trafficked. And we know that the average lifespan of someone being sex trafficked is 7 years. So on the task force, it was really important to address issues in regards to sex trafficking. One of our mandates, for example, is to hopefully increase the age with Safe Harbor, and instead of it being 24 and under, to include everyone in that regardless of their age, which is a crucial component. We've also been able to work with the BCA and get tips. We are able to follow some of the patterns that are going on, and we tried to address that, including in the foster care system, where we've had situations where youth have been trafficked out of their foster home. So we really dug in deeply into those issues. We've worked hard. I know Senator Kunesh and I will be doing a panel on Tuesday addressing sex trafficking here in the state of Minnesota. We are working hard to continue creating awareness within our communities. That involves things such as, what does grooming a community look like? How do you identify someone that's sex trafficked? And also working in conjunction with Safe Harbor to increase training for first responders and others that are out in the field all the time. So when we take all the components, including sex trafficking, into play with the task force, we were able to uncover even more levels where we needed data, where we needed changes within systems, but also address what the community needs are. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sheila. Sheila continues this incredible work. She is boots on the ground, and she's done it for a long time. And we thank you so much, Giizhik, for your hard work and your perseverance in this area. Some of the key findings are not necessarily surprising when we looked at the trauma and the life experiences of so many of the folks that came forward to share their stories and the stories of their loved ones. And a couple of the key findings really come down to systemic risk factors in our Native communities. We spoke about the historic trauma of being removed from families, boarding schools, the foster care system, easy pickings for sex trafficking, jurisdictional complications. And too often we hear authorities say, they put themselves in those situations. They might, the victims might have had real trauma and are self-medicating using different forms of self-medication. And so they brought it all on themselves. But those systemic factors are not bad lifestyle choices. Too often we hear and we see folks that believe that it's all the choices and the fault of the victims. And again, we hear a time and time again how those victims are re-victimized. But what we're finding is, looking back at these patterns that Sheila spoke about, poverty and lack of housing are key reasons why our Native communities seem to be so plagued with this kind of violence. Again, the involvement in the child welfare system and the criminal justice system really makes them vulnerable to domestic violence. And one of the statistics that we've seen time and time again, that our Native women have the highest incidences of domestic violence, and that that violence primarily, overwhelmingly comes from non-Native men. And so when folks ask, well, is it the Native men? Is it who is it? Who is doing this kind of work? It's non-Native men who realize how vulnerable our Indigenous women and boys and girls and Two-Spirit are, and take advantage of that. And then, of course, that's often a pathway into prostitution and trafficking. And those are the sort of things that we're trying to seek justice against, so that this kind of community and cultural attitude is no longer, and we don't have to worry about our girls and our young folks being out and about and being being the victims or being the focus of perpetrators that are looking for those that are so vulnerable. Let's see.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of that, when you talk about the systemic risk factors, like all of that is, the impact of colonization, right? Like when we look at poverty and homelessness and we look at the status of our communities today, it is all a direct impact of colonization. When we look at, the foster care system and the child welfare system, it's an extension of the boarding school era where our children are still being taken away. And then we look at the historical trauma and the levels of violence, and we look at domestic violence and sexual violence. And then, of course, we have to talk about racism, and we have to talk about some of the conversations and some of the reasons that that Native women are dismissed. For instance, we have heard many stories of Native women who it was murdered and it was ruled a suicide, And the family knows that it wasn't suicide, and the community knows, but nothing is really being done about it. And so, we also hear about, the racism within certain systems, and the racism that our communities are, dealing with every day in multiple systems, not just, the criminal justice system, but in healthcare, and in a number of our systems. So I'm not sure where you went, Mary. But I think we'll move into talking about, there you are.
Sorry about that.
Thought I lost you for a minute.
I'm here.
And I think, another thing that is, we've heard and have seen is, media is a system as well. And we're not only invisible, our stories aren't only invisible once, but we're invisible in the media too, right? Like, we're erased in the media. And when they do tell our stories, we have seen in the past where our, a woman's mugshots are put up in the story. And what that does is it really creates, the narrative for people to dismiss us, or to think of all the reasons why she must be to blame, or they must be to blame for what happened to them. And it's certainly not the, the good pictures that, our non-Native sisters have up when their stories are shown when they go missing.
Yeah, we've seen that time and time again, how the media has not made it a priority when one of our Native women go missing. And I think that's very clear when we look at the tragedy of Savannah LaFontaine Graywind out of South Dakota. We had heard about the tragedy, and for those of you who don't know who she was a young woman up in Fargo, North Dakota, who was 8 months pregnant. She was lured up to a neighbor's apartment where she died a violent death. The couple up there literally cut the unborn child from her womb, tossed her body into the river, and some reports say that she was not dead when she was tossed into the river, and kept the child. Police, through our social media, we all knew that something was happening, that this young woman was missing, but we didn't hear anything about it in the news. And it really wasn't until the very horrific details came out that all of a sudden they were interested in telling this horrifying tale. It wasn't enough that a young Native woman was missing, but it had to have the gruesome details in order to attract the kind of media that was necessary. And so too often, again, our Native folks, when they go missing or have been murdered, there's no response to it or minimal information about it. And one of the things that we would love to see come out of this task force is to hear more about these things as they happen, and that there's a stronger presence on Amber Alerts when they go missing, and that we can really address this in a more proactive way. So Nicole Matthews, Nicole Rogers, would you like to speak a little bit about the mandates that we are suggesting as a result of this task force?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about the mandates and it's hard to talk about all 20 of them, but maybe I can at least talk about a couple of the key mandates, and some of these you mentioned already. So, the task force created 20 recommendations that we called mandates, which we felt was a stronger term than recommendations. And these correspond directly back to the 5 areas that the Minnesota Legislature asked the task force to investigate. So you can check out the full report and check out all the details. There's a lot more, bullet points underneath each of these mandates and stuff in the report. And I'd encourage you to check it out and also check out the full report. I can put up a link to that in a minute. In these first set of recommendations, you already talked about the MMIW office, which will hopefully be created and would have both the authority and cross-agency tri-participation to hold the state accountable for creating an MMIW dashboard, tracking how we as an entire state are doing in all of these areas that contribute to the MMIW injustice over time. And this office would also help us to do things like oversee cold case reviews and evaluate any initiatives the state undertakes related to the MMIW injustice. This next set of recommendations relates back to the legislature's request to investigate and report on systems that contribute to the MMIW injustice. The task force identified both federal laws like the Violence Against Women Act and Safe Harbor, which is a state law that's under number 9. The task force recommended that Safe Harbor be expanded to include all trafficking victims, not just those aged 24 and younger. And Safe Harbor protects trafficking victims from being charged of a crime, and they receive some protections if they're identified as trafficking victims instead of like charging them with a crime of prostitution or something like that. And so that would be good if all women who are being trafficked, not just younger people, would be covered. And then again, the task force did take on bigger systemic changes, like in number 14, to address the harm that the child welfare system has done and would continue to do. It continues to do to Indigenous families. And I think there's some really interesting ideas regarding full family foster care and other innovative models that we should look into that are described a little bit in the report. One of the recommendations that seems pretty straightforward to me, but it sometimes can become a partisan issue, is number 15, teaching healthy relationships and related topics to all children in Minnesota public schools. This could especially be important for kids who maybe haven't grown up in a safe home environment or who have normalized violence. If they have seen a lot of abuse in the interpersonal relationships that they grew up in their home, they need someone to instruct them about what's safe and what's not safe and what's unhealthy. And again, going back to what Sheila was talking about as well, awareness about what grooming for trafficking might look like, as well as grooming someone to be in an abusive relationship. And the last specific recommendation that I think it's really, really important to talk about tonight is number 18. We know right now that there's a pipeline project proceeding in northern Minnesota. That's line 3. We learned through the task force research about what many advocates call the double rape of women and the environment when a large extractive project like a pipeline project moves into Indian country. And just by chance, that's where a lot of these pipelines happen to be placed, I'm sure you all know. And so the task force, if these projects are going to go forward, the task force really wants targeted prevention efforts. We expect companies like Enbridge and these other big, multi-billion-dollar companies to make real good faith efforts to address trafficking and other issues related to the MMIW injustice that might actually be caused by their company's presence in our communities. So I think I'll leave it at that for now as far as talking about the mandates, and maybe I can put up a link in the comments to the task force report. Oh, it looks like the link is up there to the DPS site. And I'll also put up a link to the Wilder site, which has the executive summary and the full report. So yeah, I would encourage everybody to take a look at that.
Thank you for sharing those with you. A lot of those mandates we will do our best to focus on at the legislature and create legislation around them in order to implement them. One of the mandates that Nicole spoke of is around consent and healthy relationships. I can tell you that for the last 3 years, I've carried a bill just doing that, allowing for curriculum, age appropriate, sanctioned, well researched literature and curriculum that we might be able to use in our schools to help kids realize and differentiate between healthy relationships, when no means no, that you do need to have consent to invade a person's space and body. And so those are some of the things that we will continue working on, all of these different issues as we move forward. Line 3 is a huge controversial issue. It's going on right now. And for those that aren't familiar with Line 3, it's an oil pipeline that's being pushed through in northern Minnesota. It's a replacement pipeline for one that's already there, traveling from Canada all the way down to the Great Lakes, and it's set to spew or plug through tons of this sludge of oil from the tar sands of Canada. And historically, we know that when there are large groups of men that gather, whether it's in the extractive world or sporting events, hunting events, anywhere that draws large groups of men, we find an uptick in violence against women and sex trafficking, and that's just a fact. That's a fact. Many people will ask me to prove that in order to justify how we cannot be pushing back against Line 3. But we know that from anecdotal evidence. We know that from evidence of other pipelines and extractment industry sites, as well as, if you remember when we had the Super Bowl here in Minneapolis and how proactive the communities were to ensure that there wasn't going to be sex trafficking, yet we know it continues across our state. And there are folks that continue to work hard to make sure that those things are not happening, and yet it continues to happen because once we get rid of one, they're going to pop up again. And so this is another one of those areas that we must continue to concentrate on. Nicole, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's so important that we address, what we're doing to Mother Earth. And, when I think about, Line 3, and I think about the money that, Enbridge had to give for education or awareness, all that is fine and good, but we know that in order for us to have prevention, for us to have a real impact, we need to have policy, and we need to really address the issue of having these pipelines, and we need to really address what happens when they're there building those pipelines, and what happens to the community, and the difficulties for law enforcement, and the difficulties with housing and trying to find housing, right? Because they're taking up all the hotels or maybe even some of the homeless shelters or the homeless bed space. And so we really need to look at the entire impact of that, and the huge impact to our land, to Mother Earth, right? And what are we doing to Mother Earth? And along with that, what are we doing, and what is the impact for our communities? What is the impact for our women and for our children, and for our relatives who live in those communities, and who are also, now dealing with all of this in their homes? So I think we need to really look at some of the policy implications around this, and it's more than just education, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Nigel, I'm not sure if you're still there. But if you are there, do you have any suggestions or thoughts about what people can do outside of this task force to support the task force or start how to support the community in any way?
Yeah, I think definitely if you haven't done it yet, read the report. I think 160 some pages can be a little bit overwhelming, but I think there's a lot to learn from there, particularly for other communities of color and white people that may not have a lot of experience or education around Native people. I think there's a lot there that can be addressed and shared to kind of build that knowledge. I think the other thing too, recognizing some of this work and what may be happening at the legislature. The session is to really make sure that you're speaking to your local representative and state senators to support any actions that come out of this report, particularly in relation to anything that is really about increasing justice for those impacted by this issue. And then I think too, just, again, understanding that the services that are out there and some of the lack of services that are out there, I think we've talked about it as a whole, but to kind of look at it also in relation to the pandemic that stretched a lot of victim services agencies then throughout this entire pandemic. And so, if you have the ability or you can open your wallet and give to your local programs in your area to help support those, building those resources, supporting Native victims of crimes and their families. And then I think just recognizing, we talked a lot about the racism that is built into these systems and recognizing that, if you're working within some of these systems, what can you do to increase your knowledge and be more proactive and be anti-racist in relation to the services that are provided by the systems or the lack of services that are being provided by the systems.
Absolutely. I know that you have worked long and hard in this area, and we are eternally thankful to you for doing that and the work that you've continued to do even after this task force. So thank you very much. Nicole Matthews, I think you wanted to chime in and maybe address or speak to some of the resources that are needed for our communities and how other people can participate in supporting this MMIW movement. And there she is.
Here I am. Yes, and while I'm pulling those up, I thought maybe we could open it up and see if there's questions, and then I will pull up some tips that people can to take action in your own community. And also, we've created some great resources on our website, and we've really pulled resources from. We have many, amazing community members and organizations and grassroots efforts that are happening that, have created materials that are on our website at MIWSAC.org. There's an entire page about this issue. I think I just seen a question pop up.
We had a comment from folks that are watching from out of state, which is really, really fabulous because honestly, we know that this is not a unique situation to Minnesota. This is nationwide, continent-wide, worldwide, and we're hoping that, it's kind of my hope that other legislators will take a look at the legislation that we have here at our task force. And I know there have been states that are watching and waiting for us to do this work so that they could model their MMIW, or we start to call it now MMIR, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives, their MMIR task forces. If we have to wait for our federal government to put something together, I think we will be waiting another couple hundred years. And so it's our hope and our wish that other state legislators will look at what we did, tune it in, fine tune it to their own communities, their state, their tribes. And before long, if every state were to do this, we would have our national task force completed and really be able to start working on sharing data across the state, across the nation, so we get a really good grip on what's happening. And there are plenty of organizations and agencies that are doing this work across the nation. When I first started, there were few, and you know, there's power in numbers, and we now have the numbers to do this work and continue working on it. Was there something else you wanted to say, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, you know, as far as addressing this issue, there's, you know, one, we need to really raise the visibility. And we need to keep, I know you have said this before too, we need to make sure that we are holding our elected officials accountable, that, you know, and that they're representing us. We voted them in to represent us. And so we need to make sure they're doing so at all levels of government, that we're not forgotten in policy and legislation. And we need to start sharing the stories of our relatives. We need to hold media accountable. We need to keep pushing these issues, and we need to keep addressing some of the systems barriers and systems challenges that we have, and keep pushing those issues. And we need to just keep working with each other, and we need to keep working in community, and always to remember that we do this because we don't, you know, I always say I'm just trying to work myself out of a job. I don't want to do this forever. I want there to be a day when we don't have to have these events, because we don't have any of these stories anymore, because we're safe in our communities and our homes and on the streets. And that's ultimately, you know, what we want. And I also want to mention that we have another event, for those of you watching, we have another event tomorrow at noon. You know, for I think 7 years now, there's been an annual MMIW event, usually a rally and a march on Valentine's Day every year. And it's in coordination, you know, with Canada has been doing this for a number of years. So it's in solidarity with our Canadian relatives that we do this on Valentine's Day, which can be pretty cold in Minnesota. And, you know, we're certainly seeing how cold it can be in February on Valentine's Day. And we would normally be in the streets raising awareness. And tomorrow, you know, sadly with the pandemic, we're not able to be in community with, you know, a couple thousand people. So we're going to have a virtual event tomorrow from noon to 2. You can tune in exactly where you tuned in today. And we will be hearing, Senator, you will be back to join us tomorrow. We're also going to have our Lieutenant Governor and the Commissioner of Public Safety. We have some amazing community activists. And we have an incredible lineup of young people that will be speaking as well. So I'm really excited for tomorrow's event, and hopefully you all will join in.
You know, I'm really heartened by the youth that have joined us in this task force and in this task of addressing the MMIR situation here in Minnesota and across the way. There have been a number of young folks that have contacted me when I was a state representative and now as a senator that ask how they can help. What can they do? They might be in college and they want to do an internship. I have a young woman that's helping us now with some of the data collection. It's very difficult to collect data. And it's the voices of the youth that are really inspiring, because, you know, our aunties, our grandmas, our great grandmas and grandpas are tired. They're tired of the hard work of survival all these years. And it's really inspiring. It's so sad, first of all, that we aren't going to have the rally and the march, because it's one of the most inspirational events every year that I look forward to. And the youth that come out that are willing to step up and step out and really fight for their relatives is so inspiring. There's busloads of young folks coming up from Chicago. They come from all over the state, and they carry signs and pictures of their loved ones that they've missed, that they've lost. And so we are so happy when we are able to bring the youth into the circle, and we're so thankful for the support and the guidance that they give us, because they're our next generation coming up, and the generation after that. We want to make sure that they are safe, that they prosper, that they have all the resources that they need in order to thrive in our state and across the nation. And so I'm very excited for tomorrow to see the youth join us for the rally with Nicole and her group.
Yeah, thank you. And I wanted to mention too, you brought up the young people that are coming from Chicago, and this is the 4th year that we've had a group of African American girls that have joined us from Chicago, from an organization called A Long Walk Home that we've worked really closely with and built just a really strong partnership with. And I wanted to read a quote from one of their girls from their group who said, "I march in solidarity with Indigenous women and girls because our stories are connected. Black and Indigenous girls are missing and murdered, and the media turns a blind eye. Our communities fail to show up for us. I march because if we don't march for each other, who will?" And it just is, I'm just so honored, and I'm always so blown away by our youth and all the incredible ways that our youth are leading us. And, and I learn so much from them every single day. So I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. And I think we are coming to the close of our event. And so I think, Senator, I think we were going to ask great-grandmother Mary Lyons to offer some closing thoughts, and then Sarah Curtis will sing a song for us.
It was a good session. Miigwech Kichimani Duo. Miigwech to all our relatives and to all our non-Indigenous allies. Thank you for these cyber circles that carry good intentions to move forward in a good way. Miigwech to all the ancestors who left imprint of memory so we never forget to stand strong. We remember the teachings of whom we really are, where we came from. We truly remember. We remember what we were taught when times would be difficult. We were told to go to our spiritual space. We remember all that was spoken of was disappearing and appearing before our very eyes. The unfolding of our prophecies our ancestors passed forward to each of us so we would remember. We remember the keys of our past, our ancestors' past, to protect the ones that stored the seeds of our future, the women. If one of us falls, a nation will fall. If we allow the world to continue to paint us with invisible masks, we will disappear. If we remain silent, the outside world will cover up the wrongdoings of what they do to our people. If we stand together, we will rise up as our ancestors once did for us to protect our future seeds. There is no such thing as a missing person, as we will no longer allow this hidden secret to hide amongst the thieves. We rise. Miigwech Manidu. And to all the modern day warriors, and to all our water protectors, and to all that are overseeing the safety of us, I want to say Miigwech, and it was an honor to sit with you ladies and gentlemen here in the cyber circle. Miigwech, and have a good evening.
Miigwech.
miigwech. An honor to be asked to sing a song in closing, and just to our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, their families, and our communities, is that today and always my prayers and hopes and dreams are with you all. Hey, hey, hey. Iaki-o, Iaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o, Yaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o. Hey, 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 Iaki-o, Iaki-o, oh, hey, hey, Yaki-o, Yaki-o, oh, hey, hey, Yaki-o, hey, hey, hey. Iaki-o, Iaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o, Yaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o, hey, hey, hey. Iaki-o, Iaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o, Yaki-o, hey, hey, Yaki-o.
Miigwech, that was beautiful. Beautiful way to close us out. Senator, do you have any final?
I would like to just show my appreciation and let you know how much we appreciate your participation, not just in this evening, but also through this journey of the last couple of years. And so I say once again, Wopatanka, Chimigwich, Pilamia, and please be safe, everybody. Look out for each other. Watch for issues that you might be able to participate. And we thank you so much for joining us here this evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Good night.
See you all tomorrow.
Giga
Yes.
Good night.